There is a thin line between love and hate, or in this case, between mercy and revenge. Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we're talking about Dune Part 2, which leaves off from Part 1, completing Paul Atreides' origin story. The first Dune movie was more of a setup, and the second one is truly the payoff. So if you didn't like the first one, it's definitely worth a watch the second time. This movie is incredibly well paced. It never feels like there's any dead time. This movie demonstrates a lot of self-control and never does more than it has to. There's always enough to keep you constantly engaged. I also thought Dune Part 2 made up for the lack of character development in Part 1. Like, this is an incredibly well written, clearly told story. And the movie does a fantastic job of staying loyal to the source material. Dune is essentially the story of a false prophet, and watching Paul transform and try to justify what will eventually become his very brutal reign was just mesmerizing. And I thought this was easily Timothée Chalamet's best performance. Like, I was very much invested and connected to his story. And the movie got us to really care about these characters. So starting with what I liked. So the story, as I said, was well written, incredibly well paced. Following the fall of House Atreides, Paul and his mother were left to fend for themselves until they were able to come across the Fremen, the society of people that have incredible surviving and fighting skills. I liked how the Fremen were depicted in the movie, especially during the fight sequences. Like, the way they popped out of the sand was very cool. The Fremen have been hunted and exploited for many years, and I appreciate how most of the movie is set in the desert. Like, it feels a lot more realistic. Like, even if you're not wholly invested in the story, it's hard not to get immersed in this world. I thought Javier Bardem was a scene stealer as this Fremen who deeply believes that Paul really is the one. I like how they didn't depict the Fremen as this monolithic group. Like, they all have different personalities and they all value different things, and they're not totally in unison in terms of how they should proceed, let alone if Paul is actually this Messiah. The script is very patient in terms of how it builds Paul's character up to be this false Messiah. At first, he just wants protection for himself and his mother, but by the end, they both become incredibly vicious and incredibly power hungry. Paul is torn between mercy and revenge. Like, on one hand, he wants to avenge his father, avenge his house, but at the same time, he doesn't want all these people to die on his behalf. Now, how much of Paul's sort of eventual reign is calculated is left up to the viewer to decide. When Paul and his mother first encounter like the Fremen society, half of them truly believe that he is the Messiah. And his first reaction is, how can I convince the other half that I really am the one? Like, that was kind of his first instinct. And unfortunately, he's unable to do this until he garners their respect. I liked how the relationship between different characters developed. Like, the more time Paul spends with the Fremen, the more like them he feels. Like, he eventually becomes one of them, and he has this extensive knowledge in terms of the royals, in terms of all these great houses, but he doesn't know much about the desert. And so this combination of knowledge eventually leads to his success. His relationship with Chani, played by Zendaya, was incredibly well constructed. She never believes that he's a Messiah. However, she loves him, but she's torn because she doesn't want to see her people manipulated and controlled by this false prophecy. Like, the Fremen have always been exploited, and it seems like Paul is positioning himself to do the exact same thing. I like how every single test Paul is put under, like, the movie never like pats itself on the back. It never feels corny or like a caricature. Like, there's this one spectacular scene with the sandworm, and you have to see this movie in IMAX because I felt like I was getting sand in my mouth. The way Paul passes each of his tests, it happens quite gradually. And so slowly he starts to become one of them. Like, they start to see him as just another member of their tribe. And the way his mother, the way he is able to slowly infiltrate is what enables them to basically wreak havoc by the end of the movie. And it really does feel like he has a cult by the end. Like, it really feels like this death cult. Throughout the movie, Paul is basically fighting these visions, and he has these reoccurring dreams of basically death and destruction if he is to pursue this path of revenge. And so this vision that he has throughout the first movie and the second movie, like, this is actually the true vision. Like, his instincts are correct. However, his visions are corrupted when he drinks this water of life, or this potion of death, essentially, and he starts to see something entirely different. And suddenly he starts to see multiple paths, but the problem is all these paths lead to destruction. And the script takes its time building Paul as the Messiah, not just in the eyes of all these people, but in Paul's eyes too. Like, he doesn't fully believe that he is a Messiah until the end of until this like grand speech. And so when we get to this speech where he basically is a self-proclaimed, like, I am the one, it's so intense. You feel the fear. You're like literally hanging on his every word. And everything he's saying to try and convince these people that he is the one is just truly the devil's work. And I liked how the voice changed. Like, he starts to get this really deep, just dark voice. And the voice change, plus his personality change, plus Hans Zimmer's score was just like, it really stresses the point that this man is about to transform for the worst. And the score is like its own character. Like, they crank it up to the absolute maximum. So it's like, boom, like they really hit you over the head with it. Like, it's really epic. You know, the score in itself is like key to understanding, like, he has now transitioned to the dark side. Much as Paul tries to position himself as an insider, he's really no different than the colonizers before him or the people who overthrew his family. And Paul's self-image is just as important as the way that people see him. Like, the script is very smart in stressing this point, because Paul doesn't see himself as a bad person, let alone, you know, as a Messiah. However, over time, he starts to kind of take on this persona. And people who eventually become colonizers, who eventually end up exploiting people, they don't see themselves as exploitative. They don't see themselves as abusive. And I felt like this was a great commentary, because, like, in order for you to gain your freedom, in order for you to enjoy the life that you live, all these luxuries, the caveat is that we have to go and invade and destroy these people over here. And this is a logic that has been used for centuries to justify invading and killing people from other countries. Paul does this amazing thing where he equates basically his desire for revenge with, like, the Fremen struggle for freedom. Like, he kind of makes it one and the same. This movie is incredibly intellectual, and it just presents a lot of ideas, and it feels very modern. Like, the idea of a Messiah in itself is corrupt, right? And it really speaks to the way that people use religion to control people and essentially create this social contract where it's like, listen, I can give you everything that you need, but in exchange, you can never question me. You have to follow me, and if need be, you have to die for me. And these great houses in Dune, like, they don't really care about the betterment of society. Like, everything they're doing is to advance themselves, is to make themselves more money, is to retain their power, and false prophets arise when people are in very desperate situations. In terms of characters, the script is very careful never to distract us from the main plot. So starting with the villains, House Harkonnen, like, these people are wild. Sometimes they do feel a bit one-dimensional and a bit like, really? But they're still captivating, and they're still just absolutely mesmerizing to watch. Fade Rotha, played by Austin Butler, is a scene stealer, and he's not in the movie too much, but he's in it enough to tease that final fight sequence. And again, he is just hypnotizing. I thought David Bautista as the Beast was also memorable. He gave his character more emotional depth, but he wasn't in the movie all that much. But the time he was in it, again, he did his thing. And you get the sense that he was so over this family by the end of it. And the movie doesn't really have time to get into the depths of each houses. And especially specifically with House Harkonnen and this Raggedy Baron, like, this man has a very strong hold over his family, and he's constantly testing them. He's incredibly sinister. He's incredibly sadistic. And you do get glimpses of that in the movie, but the movie leaves it to your imagination to kind of fill in the blanks. But again, it doesn't have time to really get into the depths of depravity when it comes to these people. When it comes to the fall of the House Atreides, it goes beyond House Harkonnen. All these great houses, as we come to find out. Again, the movie is very good at trying to tell this bigger story. Like, it's incredibly, like, ambitious when it comes to its storytelling. Is that all these great houses are basically vying for self-preservation, and unfortunately, Paul's dad was seen as vulnerable because he wasn't as ruthless and as paranoid as all the other leaders. However, this will be made up for by his son Paul. The movie also spends a great deal of time with the Bene Gesserit, which are basically a powerful social, religious, and political force that, like everyone else, only cares about themselves. And Florence Pugh is another actress that's not in the movie all that much, but the time period that she's in it, I felt that she did a great job of depicting this Bene Gesserit, who is slowly understanding kind of the sinister nature of this organization that she's a part of. Instead of guiding leaders to sensible and politically sound decisions, they're essentially manipulating and coercing leaders to do what's best for them, right? Like, they don't really care to guide these leaders, to guide these people in power, to do the right thing. They only care about what's right for them. This is a great commentary in, like, there's no such thing as a neutral organization, whether it be organized religion, whether it be charitable organization. Like, everyone has their own agenda, everyone has their own way of looking at things. And so you can never be too skeptical. And I thought the contrast between Florence Pugh's character and Léa Seydoux was really important. Like, say, Léa Seydoux is not in it all that much. However, the contrast really does stress how these women are basically just there as tools to keep the Reverend Mother in power. And speaking of Reverend Mothers, I thought Jessica, played by Rebecca Ferguson, was perfect as Paul's mother. Like, in the beginning, she's trying to keep her son grounded, trying to keep him focused. However, over time, she starts to change, right? She also develops this bloodlust. And she never believes that her son is the Messiah. However, she does see an opportunity to regain the power they lost, to get the revenge that they so desperately want. And so, being a Bene Gesserit, like, she knows the ways of mind control. She knows how to get inside people's heads. She knows how to get people to do exactly what she wants them to do. And so she kind of uses these powers for evil. And what's interesting is her biggest obstacle is actually her son. Like, that's the thing. Like, if she can convince him, she can convince like anybody. The way she slowly infiltrates the society is really fascinating, because she, it's slowly, they take over. And the more they believe in her, the more she's able to convince them that Paul really is the one. Like, she's able to push this narrative forward. I thought Josh Brolin as Gurney was also much needed. He added some energy to the plot. I thought the contrast between him and Chani was perfect, because neither one of them believe Paul is any messiah. However, they are willing to use this storyline if it does get them freedom, if it does get them revenge. But over time, they become increasingly disturbed by the fact that Paul starts to drink his own Kool-Aid. Like, there's a difference between going along with something because you want to get something, to actually believing that you are the one. And going back to this story, like, this is a tale as old as time. Like, this idea of false prophets, this idea of, like, the one, but it's set in this, like, futuristic society that's literally about to collapse, which is just, it's so eerie to think about. So finally, I just wanted to comment on the visuals. As I said, this movie is in awe. The movie never shows off just to show off. And again, I strongly recommend you see it in IMAX, because it's one hell of a experience. Like, I think everything works well together. The visuals, the dialogue, the acting, like, all of it just perfectly synchronized. I like how they make all these crazy sort of events, all these crazy costumes seem super normal. Like, there is a part in the movie where they discover that Paul's family has an arsenal of nuclear weapons. And so with these weapons, like, they're able to actually strategize, and it feels like a war movie. Like, they're trying to plan, they're trying to do all these things that feel very grounded. And then they ride in on these, like, giant sandworms, which just feels out of this world. Like, again, the contrast between reality and just otherworldliness is fantastic. I also like the final fight sequence. It's very short, it's very sweet, it's very well choreographed. Like, even though you know that Paul is going to win, it still, like, keeps you on the edge of your seat. And he doesn't win all that easily, right? Like, Fade Rotha, like, based on what we've seen of him, he was not a man that was going to go down easily. And there is a conversation to be had. I wanted to touch on this, like, dialogue. Like, I saw an article where the director basically commented on how he doesn't really like dialogue all that much, or something along these lines. And I think one of the reasons this movie works is because there isn't a lot of, like, overly dramatic monologues. Like, a lot of the dialogue here is very to the point. It doesn't beat you over the head with it. You don't get these emotional or these angry scenes. Like, there isn't all this like overacting to distract you. And I think for that reason, the pacing works really well. And they don't also, like, try to, give you too much information, so it's not that difficult to follow. So in terms of dialogue, I think with a movie like this and a story like this that's told in so many parts, you do have to limit it, just so the audience doesn't get confused. Like, this isn't a series where you know, we have many episodes to kind of unpack all this. Like, we only got 2 hours, you know, so you got to get to the point. So I think the dialogue here and keeping it succinct really did help with the pacing and worked well with the visuals. Like, again, everything is very well synchronized and works well together. And I think I was most impressed by the character development in this movie, wanting us to know how the story ends. Like, it doesn't just overly rely on visuals and an amazing score, because to be honest, like, that just doesn't work. Some of these scenes, especially with Timothée Chalamet as Paul, like, you get hyped. Like, you are like in it with him. Like, you're watching in complete awe. And again, the visuals aren't enough for that. Like, we have to feel the character development. We have to feel the growth in their relationships. This movie did a good job of not overwhelming its characters with all these sort of grand things around it. So overall, I highly recommend this film. You guys let me know what you think, and until next time.